Some buildings in my neighborhood stay empty forever. Now I know why. I first stared into the pit the day of the first earthquake. It was early September. A couple days after Jenna and I moved into the Werner building in the Koreatown district of Los Angeles. I was walking home from a CVS run. I'd found a good parking spot for once. A free space without a meter right in front of the Werner building, and I wasn't about to give it up for the sake of plastic hangers and Red Bull. Especially not when the alternative was a 6-block jog on an unseasonably cool, pleasant day. The pit sat at the corner of a side street lined with squat little trees and red brick. Art Deco-inspired apartment buildings left over from a bygone era when Mid-Wilshire was a playground for the Hollywood elite. The pit would eventually become a strip mall with an underground parking lot, according to the building plan on display. But in early September it was still a lifeless construction site surrounded by a mesh-covered rent-a-fence. Curious, I peered through a tear in the barrier and saw exactly what I'd been expecting to see. A square hole dug out of the bone-dry earth. Nothing exciting, nothing threatening, just another unfinished development in a gentrifying neighborhood. But I couldn't look away. I stood like an idiot, plastic CVS bag dangling from my hand, face pressed against filthy black fabric, staring at a giant hole. I imagined climbing the fence, hopping to the dusty ground, and throwing myself off the cliff, as though the hard dirt floor of the pit would transform into water beneath me. There's a French term, l'appel du vide, the call of the void. It's the subconscious drive to self-sabotage, the inexplicable urge that propels us towards the things from which we should cower in fear. The day of the earthquake was the day I first heard the call, and every day since then, I've been dragged further and further into the void. The earthquake hit around 9:30 that night. It was an event experienced and quickly forgotten. A 4.5 on the Richter scale. Strong enough to inspire a deluge of earthquake-related posts and clog my Twitter feed, but not strong enough to do any actual damage. When I felt the ground shift under me, I was leaning on the second-floor balcony of the Werner building, sipping my Red Bull and staring across the street at a fenced-in, overgrown empty lot. My new apartment in the Werner building, south of Wilshire in Koreatown, like so many aspects of my life, had come about less by desire than a lack of better options. I'd previously lived in North Hollywood. I had my own studio with air conditioning, a pool, and on-site laundry. Then, in August, I quit my shitty Burbank barista job for a slightly less shitty concierge gig at a renovated downtown hotel. 3 trips south on the 101 at rush hour convinced me, unequivocally, it was time to move. A decision to live with Jenna, like the Werner building, was a choice made out of convenience. She and I met 2 years before, as co-workers at a Starbucks in Pasadena, her after-school job, my humiliating post-collegiate drop in standards. We'd kept in touch on Facebook and Instagram, commented on each other's photos, swapped smiley face emojis. It was through social media that I'd learned she, like I, was looking for a roommate in a place south of the hills. Jenna worked night shifts for a Hollywood ambulance company. She'd departed a couple hours before the earthquake, leaving me alone in our 2-bedroom apartment. For $2,100 a month, we got ancient pipes, a roach problem, no air conditioning, and an aesthetic best described as white lady in a horror movie. I'd opened all the windows and turned on the fan, but the afternoon had warmed and the thick walls of the Werner building made an oven of our little unit. It was too hot to accomplish anything productive, so I wandered to the second-floor balcony instead. Then the world vibrated, upturning my energy drink and instigating a violent rattle of metal on metal. Seconds later, all was still. The metallic clatter, though, continued as gravity caught up to inertia. Curious as to where the noise was coming from, I walked to the edge of the balcony and peered around the building. I saw a rickety fire escape, barely clinging to the stucco wall by nails probably hammered in the 1950s. The rattling was a loose ladder smacking against its base. The structure seemed completely pointless. It descended to a platform on the 3rd floor, from which a jump to the asphalt below would be a jump to one's death. Death by fire or death by massive trauma? I thought. I should decide which one I'd prefer. just in case this place goes up in flames. By the next morning, I'd forgotten about the pit, the earthquake, and the useless fire escape. I began to explore Koreatown. Koreatown is blatantly, perennially dirty. Discarded fast food bags and abandoned household items collect like driftwood along the thin patches of dry grass between the sidewalks and the curb, playing host to nests of roaches. There are a lot of homeless people. They stake temporary claims on the steps of the Korean Methodist Church, beg for change outside Ralph's, leave their stolen shopping carts stuffed with trash and festering perishables by bus stops. When I went out at night, I'd see them sleeping on the sidewalks, curled under filthy blankets. But one bit at a time, I fell in love. Jenna worked most nights. There wasn't a lot of appeal to sitting alone in our sauna of an apartment, so I started taking long walks after the sun went down. And, suddenly, Koreatown became one of those I Spy books I loved as a kid. Everywhere I looked, something new and interesting caught my eye. Those blocks around the Werner building seemed thrown together like the window display of a pawnshop. Assorted pieces propped practically against one another with little regard for cohesion or theme or aesthetic merit. There were Korean barbecue joints that didn't have an English menu, cash and carry liquor shops next to trendy eateries, beat-up taco trucks stalled outside the Korean market, expensive coffee shops open until 2 a.m. and salons with names like Happy Nail and bars on the windows. I found liquid nitrogen ice cream joints up hidden staircases, record shops nestled in the top floor corners of shopping complexes with one entrance and exit, karaoke rooms in the basements of office buildings populated by Korean doctors and lawyers and bankers, dark, dirty alleys with gorgeous graffiti wall art. I started taking my camera with me on my walks. I'd never particularly been into urban exploration or gritty realism, but the neighborhood inspired me. I put the better photographs on my DeviantArt page, and, to my surprise, they garnished more positive attention than any of my drawings or short stories. Then, I had an even better idea. I'd met a number of interesting people during my nighttime sojourns. They all liked to talk, to tell stories about the neighborhood, the history of the neighborhood, how the neighborhood used to be. I decided to record all of this local lore, to create a sort of oral, visual online diary of collective experience. One sat in October. I took a walk to a favorite hidden gem, an independent used bookstore called the Page Turner, located on the second floor of Shopping Plaza off Olympic between a check cashing place and a tanning salon. On previous trips, I'd found V.C. Andrews novels long out of print, Agatha Christie anthologies, and books of photography from pre-revolutionary Iran, all under $10. The lady who owned and operated the Page Turner, Shannon, sat behind the register, watching a video on her iPhone. I made a beeline for the back. There, the oldest and strangest volumes sat in boxes on the floor or thrown haphazardly on rickety wooden shelves. A paper sign reading 50 cents each hung above. I liked it, they're the best. Amongst the dopey romance novels out of print since the 50 seconds, the vanity-published conspiracy theories of Hollow Earth, the golden-bound reference books and outdated encyclopedias, reality felt slightly altered in that dusty corner of the Page Turner. I reached for a book on an unstable shelf above my head. I don't remember what the book was. There might have been a dragon on the spine. I grabbed a hold of it and tugged, and I must have leaned on the shelf with my other hand for balance because it collapsed under my fingers, then crashed into the shelf below it, spilling its contents all over the carpeted floor. I jumped back and yelped. I heard footsteps behind me, Shannon rushing over to appraise the mess I'd made. And mess it was. But one aspect of the literary dogpile caught my attention. It was a small, thin volume, black and nondescript. On the cover were two shapes. A 7 with a swirl at the tip, and a curly and a white sheet of paper peeked out from between the pages. I snatched up the little book and opened to a random page. It was written in a language I'd never seen before. There were a lot of curves and triangles. And, below one paragraph, a simple illustration, a blob-like creature with 10 stout legs, 3 curled horns popping out of what I guessed was its head, pitch black eyes, and a jagged mouth. It was terrifying in a way I couldn't completely explain. Shit, not again. I turned. Shannon had arrived, shaking her head and scowling. Don't worry, sweetheart, she said to me. I've got to get rid of these shelves. I'll clean it up. I held out the little black book. Hey, do you know what this is? She plucked it from my hand and flipped through the pages. Vague recognition on her face. Jesus Christ. I thought I got rid of all these. There are more. I asked. What language is that? She shrugged. No idea. And yeah, the weirdos who rented this space before me left a few books like this behind. I threw them on the discount shelf, but they didn't sell. I thought I'd toss them all. Who rented this space before you? Some Christian group, Shannon replied. She shook her head. I never met them, myself. The rental agent said they left in a real hurry. Secretive folks, she called them. I've been here 10 years. And the most I've gotten from renters who've been here longer is that they were, odd. Religious nuts. She handed the book back to me. You can keep this. If you want. It's worth shit to me. I slipped the book into my purse. I knew someone who'd be thrilled at the prospect of decoding chicken scratch out of a bizarre tome. My old college roommate, Adrian, who was pursuing her master's in linguistics at USC. Seriously. Amelia. What is this? Jenna and I sat on the couch, me looking over a batch of photographs from the night before, her paging through the little black book. I told you, I said. It's like a book of summoning spells or something. The chick at the shop said it belonged to some religious whack jobs who were here, like 10 years ago. These illustrations are disturbing. She held up a page. It depicted a human-like figure with elongated, alien eyes, a face resembling that of an insect, and antennas sticking out of his head. What was creepier, though, was the beast he sat atop. Its face was round and bloated, with an equine nose but opal, eerily human eyes and a thick, scribbled mane. Something fell out of the book and landed on our dusty carpet. I picked it up. It was the sheet of paper I'd seen earlier, folded and yellowed with age, peeking out from between the pages. I unfolded it. On the paper was a blotchy black ink drawing that resembled a simple map. The sort of map you'd draw in the old days when someone gave you directions to a place. Before GPS. Lines, almost but not quite forming a grid-like pattern, with a pentagon superimposed on top. Dots at the 5 corners of the pentagon, each accompanied by a simple little picture. A pitcher with a rounded bottom and a curled handle. A spoked wheel. 3 circles, linked together like the Olympic rings. A butterfly. And a cross, but with a third line through the T. What do you think this is? I showed Jenna. A map or something. Jenna sighed. They couldn't, write anything on it. In English. Wouldn't that have been easier to work with than kindergarten drawings? Easier for them to read it. Maybe. Easier for outsiders like us to decipher their nefarious plans. Definitely. But do you know what bothers me the most? I snatched the book back from Jenna, closed it, and held up the cover. I feel like I've seen this symbol before. It wasn't until a few hours later that I figured out where I'd seen the pictograph on the cover of my indecipherable tome. The fancy 7 and the curly N Jenna had left by then. She'd gone to take her dirty clothes to the laundromat on Vermont. We planned on hitting a hookah bar I'd found by Wilshire and Oxnard that night, with a girl from the building named Wren. I took some pictures of the pages within the little black book and emailed them to Adrian, the former college roommate studying linguistics. Then I transcribed one of my spontaneous late-night interviews, a cook at Denny's this time, who'd told me a cute story about hawking street dogs outside the Wiltern after a Guns N' Roses show. The revelation came as I clicked through the thumbnails of photos I'd taken, searching for the perfect one to accompany drunk groupies and tattooed hustlers selling bootlegged t-shirts. I lingered on a shot of the empty lot across from the Werner building, taken through a hole in the cheap plywood that covered the fence. It was an experimental failure. Too dark to be good for anything, but a wooden telephone pole had been caught in the flash. There was graffiti on the telephone pole. Old, fading, red graffiti. A 7 with an extra wave. And a curly and an exact match to the odd symbol on the cover of the little black book. Later that night, on my way to the hookah bar, I approached the empty lot across from the Werner building. Since the night of the earthquake, when I first spied the place from my balcony, I'd afforded it little attention. Along the plywood buffered fence were cheap, tagged up signs reading private property, no trespassing, and East River development. I stopped in front of the telephone pole inadvertently caught in my photo. They were there, all right. In the light of my phone, I could recognize the 2 logograms, spray painted in red. A 7 with a flourish. And a curly N. I reached out and touched the letters. They were old and worn, nearly invisible if you weren't looking for them. Then I noticed 2 things at the same time. A gate, from which a broken padlock hung, was cracked open, allowing me to peer into the empty lot. And, in the middle of the empty lot, a solitary figure crouched near to the ground. I jumped. The figure was moving. In the dim yellow light of nearby street lamps, I could see it was a person, braced on all fours, scratching at the ground, digging like a dog. There was a faint crunch, crunch, crunch as earth was dislodged. Curious, I stepped through the open gate and into the lot. East River Development obviously cared little about the state of their property. It was a burnt yellow wasteland. Thorny weeds grew thick out of the tough, dry ground, as high as my waist, cluttered with trash. I got a better look at the figure. It was a man, about 50 feet away from me, kneeling in a clearing, clawing at the dirt. He was thin, but I couldn't make out any other distinctive features. I didn't move any closer. An icy shudder rippled down my spine. I got the inexplicable sense that the gate was more than a physical barrier, that I was committing a sin far graver than trespassing. Scratch, crunch, scratch. "Sir," I called out to him. He ignored me. Crunch, scratch, scratch. There was something oddly graceful in his movements. Something fluid, flexible. "Man, do you need any help?" Scratch, crunch, scratch, scratch. It couldn't have been easy. The ground below my feet felt as hard as a rock. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I was about to shine my phone's flashlight on him when he raised a long, thin arm and waved. Crunch, crunch, scratch, scratch, scratch. He kept on waving. His bony hand extended, pale fingers catching the moonlight. The chill I felt curdled into panic, and I turned and all but dove back through the gate, then ran until I saw the brighter lights of Wilshire. I hurried the rest of the way to the bar. Starlight, boba, and hookah. The digging man unsettled me. I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the skeletal, milky white appendage he'd raised to acknowledge me. What was he doing, anyways? I assumed he was homeless. The neighborhood's transient population was obviously familiar with the lot, judging by the discarded mattresses I'd seen lying around. Was he digging for treasure? Burying his daily panhandling earnings? It seemed impractical, at the least. Or maybe it was just the energy the empty lot exuded. They say you can sense someone staring at you, even when you're fast asleep. That's what I felt as I stood amongst the dry weeds. Unseen eyes boring into my back. Jenna showed up with Ren 15 minutes later. I'd found us a table and ordered a watermelon slush with tapioca balls. I came across Starlight, boba, and hookah on one of my nightly wanders. I wasn't much for smoking hookah, but Jenna had never been and Ren insisted she just had to try it once. "This place is kind of trashy," Ren said as she sat down. Ren was 30-ish, a bartender downtown and a bit of a goth. I couldn't quite understand why she'd sought out my 19-year-old roommate as a friend, but Jenna repeatedly assured me she was really sweet. "Yeah, it's in our budget," I said. "You guys can pick the flavor. I don't really care." Ren picked peach. When it was my turn, I took a long drag, allowing the flavored smoke to coat my throat and calm my still jangled nerves. The digging homeless man still dominated my thoughts. Why was I obsessing over him? Over that pale, skeletal arm? I passed the hose to Jenna. Jenna breathed in, dropped the long tube, and bent over in a fit of coughing. So, Ren said to me, Jenna says you're writing a book of urban legends. It's a blog, I said. And not so much urban legends as actual stories from people who have lived in the neighborhood. I pulled the hose back to me. Ren nodded. Has anyone told you about the Mid-City Mauler? The what? Jenna asked, before collapsing into another coughing fit. The Mid-City Mauler. Ren repeated. Her eyes lit up, like she was primed to share an irresistible bit of gossip. She scooted towards me on the couch. This story is, like, crazy. She began. It all happened about 10 years ago now. Right after I moved in. You've lived here for 10 years? I asked, probably a bit too incredulous. I couldn't imagine anyone putting up with the Werner building for that amount of time. Yeah. It's the only place in town you can get kimchi on a taco. Not the point. Anyways, right after I moved in, people started finding half-eaten animals. Birds, squirrels, whatever. Like, something had taken bites out of them, sucked out of their innards, and left their corpses like chicken bones. But it wasn't a big deal. You know, there's a lot of feral cats around. Ren took another drag, pausing for dramatic effect. Then, the feral cats started dying. Same thing, mangled and chewed and left where they fell. And after the cats, it was dogs. Pets. Then, people. I couldn't help it. I laughed. There's no way that's true. Jenna insisted. What, like the thing was eating people? Ren raised her eyebrows. The first two were homeless. They found the first guy. Some middle-aged alcoholic from Michigan, stuffed in a dumpster outside 7-Eleven. His throat torn out, both legs bitten off. Intestines leaking. Now I bet you can figure out why this bothered so many people. What about a half-eaten, eviscerated man wouldn't seriously disturb anyone? They found him in the dumpster. Jenna replied. A wild animal couldn't hoist a corpse into a dumpster. Bingo, babe. Ren clapped her hands. And the lid of the dumpster was shut. Then, 2 weeks later, they found the second bum in a boarded-up tobacco shop on 8th Street. The employees at the place next door complained of a bad smell. The cops came to check it out. And there he was. Missing hobo number 2. Apparently, something had been living there. They found some torn-up newspapers in a pile. Like a bed. The cops didn't go into much detail. But the rest of the block kicked around a few contradicting stories. No one was sure exactly how long the homeless man had been dead, or how many pieces he'd been discovered in. After that, everyone started going crazy. Koreatown turned into a ghost town as soon as the sun went down. There were stories. Some people thought they were ritualistic cult murders. Something about jackhammer noises at night. But every lead the police followed went cold. Anyways, all was quiet for a month or so. Then a guy called saying his girlfriend hadn't come home from work and she wasn't answering her phone. Grace Jimenez was the girl's name. Some waitress at a barbecue place. The cops found her in a few hours. Want to guess where? Jenna and I just stared. I had no desire to guess. The roof of their building. Ren answered. Which was weird. Because the only door to the roof was locked and dead-bolted. The manager had the only key. And he had an airtight alibi. He was out of the state when Grace was found. And do you want to know what else was weird? The condition of Grace's body. Jenna gulped. Please, no more details. Fine, no details. All I'll say is she'd been dead for at least 2 weeks. So, why hadn't her live-in boyfriend reported her missing earlier? Ren paused again, took a long drag, blew a white cloud over her shoulder. Her boyfriend was the murderer. I asked. Ren shook her head. No, because her boyfriend swore he had seen his girlfriend lying next to him in bed the morning before her body was discovered. I'm not losing my deposit because of anything that came out of Ren Casey's mouth. Jenna plopped down on our futon with a bowl of popcorn and a Pepsi. I lounged on the sofa. 6 Google windows of gut-churning articles open on my laptop. She's telling the truth. I told my roommate. The Mid-City Mauler. active from estimated May 2007 to August 2007. 3 known victims, though possibly more. Yes, 10 years ago. Jenna insisted. Whoever did it. I highly doubt they're going to randomly pop back up again. She wasn't making me feel any better, and she knew it. She changed her tone. Look, if you're scared, we can buy a gun. Until then, I've got a baseball bat under my bed. I can do a lot of damage with a bat. You've watched. The lady had a point. When we'd worked at Starbucks together, I'd walk with Jenna after our shifts to the park where her varsity softball team held practice. And, yes, she was a powerhouse with a bat. Besides, Jenna continued with a smile, I feel like you're the girl who lives through the horror movie. Artistic, doesn't wear a ton of makeup. Walking introvert meme, not like other girls. I made a face. You're making me sound like the Twitter accounts I want to punch. I, on the other hand, am the low-level person in uniform. I die 5 minutes after I first appear on screen. I laughed, shut my laptop, and convinced myself I was being ridiculous. We just signed a 12-month lease. I didn't want to go through the hassle of looking for another place, and I really couldn't afford to lose that deposit. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up in a cold sweat. The man digging, the skeletal homeless man in the abandoned lot. That eerie feeling, like hundreds of maniacal eyes fixed on me, stinging like a knife wound every time recalled it. I suddenly understood why. That hand, that pale white, graceful, bony arm extended in response to my repeated attempts to get his attention. There was no dirt on his raised, oscillating hand. The man had been digging, frantically digging, with 2 hands. He'd been digging as he waved. He had 3 hands,